The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our friends out on the West Coast. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today for our course rating webinar on measuring and effective playing length. My name is John Suazo, and you will also hear from both Scott Hobday and Matt Duffy from the USGA Handicapping and Course Rating Department today. This is the first webinar in a series of three USGA webinars designed to help new course raters. And first off, as always, I'd like to just confirm that everybody in the audience can hear my voice and see our slides as well. If you could leave us a quick confirmation in the questions tab of GoToWebinar, that would be greatly appreciated. Perfect, we're seeing some confirmations there. So if you have any generic course rating questions outside of the scope of today's presentation, feel free to contact us at crdbquestions@usga.org. This presentation is scheduled to last 90 minutes today. We do have a lot to cover, and we will have some breaks for questions between each section. So please feel free to submit any questions you may have through the questions tab as well in GoToWebinar. We will address as many as possible throughout the course of the webinar today, and we will get to any questions that we were unable to answer at the end of the webinar if time allows. Please note we do have a very large virtual audience today, so we will do our best to address as many questions as possible. And those that we don't get to today, we will have a chance and provide written responses to these questions. We'll distribute these via email to you all as well. I'm just seeing a couple of questions in here to reiterate the email address to reach out to us. That would be crdbquestions@usga.org. With that, I'm going to pass this over to Scott Hobday, who will get us started today. And thanks again for joining us.
All right, thanks, John. And I know some of you may have attended some of our previous webinars that we did last year. Obviously, with the COVID situation, we didn't get a chance to go out and do any in-person seminars last year. So we did do one kind of 3-hour or 2.5-hour session that covered the entire system. For this year, we decided we're going to break it into 3 different webinars and kind of go a little bit more into depth of each obstacle, EPL, et cetera, and do it over 3 different sessions as opposed to trying to cram it all into one session at a time. So I'm going to move forward here. So we have an agenda here. If I can, there we go. Like it said on the description of the seminar, we're going to talk about measuring, and then we're going to go into the EPLs. So we're going to go through roll, elevation, dog leg force layup, wind, and altitude. This session is really more geared towards beginners or inexperienced raters and not necessarily the experienced and veteran raters, but so it will cover a little bit more of the high level stuff and not go into too much specifics on exceptions and some of the things that are unusual. So if anybody has any questions, try to keep them more high level, try to keep them more about the content that we're covering as opposed to things that are very unique or 1 in a million type situations you might see out there. So getting into measuring here, I'm probably not gonna teach you how to measure a course today because there's a little bit more to it than just a 20-minute session on measuring. But it's a really good idea to have a background on how courses are measured or how they should be measured. When a course rating team is out there doing the ratings, there are going to be a few holes at times where you're going to wonder maybe how the hole was measured. Maybe it doesn't match up with some of the numbers you're seeing with your lasers, or a sprinkler head that doesn't make a whole lot of sense relative to the distance that's on the scorecard. So we just want to give you a little bit of a background on measuring and how it's done, so that you have that knowledge going forward. Some of you may actually be part of your measuring team at your AGAs. Some of you might become a measurer at some point down the road. It's very different than rating, obviously. There's no book. It's really just going out there with some devices and determining the measurements. But it's, again, a really good thing for any rater to know the background of. So moving forward here, one of the key things about measuring or measurements in general is that scorecard yardage can be incorrect. I've measured at least a few hundred courses in my career. The majority of the scorecards that I saw going in were a little bit inflated, maybe not half of them, but pretty close. So don't take those scorecards as being the absolute measurements. So what we say in the course rating system is it cannot be used as the sole source of measurement. Must be verified or validated. So In an ideal world, the golf associations themselves, the AGAs, would measure all courses to be rated. And I know many of them do. Most associations either have lasers or have GPS devices that will go out and measure these courses. However, if an outside agency measures the golf course, the AGA must still verify that those measurements were done correctly. So here's a common situation, or what we've seen in the past and probably still in the current landscape, is that, you know, with access to some of these mapping programs that are out there, Google Earth being probably the most popular. Oops, going back one here. You know, you can actually go to Google Earth and actually do a little bit of pre-work sometimes for a course rating or measuring. This happens to be a hole that I know that's, you know, a course that I've played a few times. And on the scorecard and on the website that they have listed, they list the course, this particular hole, at 563 from the black tees, 553 from the blue tees, and 543 from the white tees. Yet when you go to Google Earth here and you kind of stretch it out to from the back tee pad all the way to the middle of the green, the longest you could get was 530. So it's at least 20 to 30 yards short of what the actual measurement is. So using those scorecard yardages or using the yardages from the club's website would inflate the yardage. And if you do this on multiple holes, it can really start to impact the course rating and slope rating. So one thing we have seen in the past is that, and still probably happens, is that courses tend to, you know, go from the back of the tee to the back of the green. So they're not using kind of a permanent marker based on the midpoint of the tee and then going to the center of the green. So that's where you'll see some of these courses that, you know, again, will have some inflated yardages. The other thing is all of our measurements are done to the middle of the green. So it's not to the back of the green, it's not to the front of the green. So all of our measurements for course rating are going to be to the middle of the green. So that's a kind of a key part of measuring. So moving forward here, one slide, you can see what the impact is if a course is not measured correctly. So for men, every 22 yards equals 1/10 of a stroke for scratch, and every 16 yards equals 1/10 of a stroke for bogey. And for women, those numbers are even smaller, 18 yards for 1/10 of a stroke for scratch, and only 12 yards for 1/10 of a stroke for the bogey. So if you're off, you know, 10 or 15 yards on a single hole, it's not going to make a big difference. But if all of a sudden there's a dozen holes that are off by 10 or 15 yards, and now you're up into the 120 to 150 yard range, now you're talking about, you know, half a stroke to upwards of a stroke off on the rating just from the mismeasurement. So really, we do want to make sure that the measurements are accurate and they're correct, because it has a pretty big influence on, especially the course rating that's, you know, pretty heavily weighted by the yardage of the course. So how do we measure courses? As it says, this is straight from the course rating manual. Hole measurements can be made using a laser or GPS, but the instrument must have an accuracy of 6 inches or less, up to 250 yards, which is our longest shot within the course rating system. So you can see there on the bottom left, you know, your handheld kind of commercially, or your consumer laser, your Callaway, your, you know, some of the ones that you can buy at Dick's Sporting Goods or some of the golf shops, those are not, you know, at that level of accuracy. They are accurate. Most of them are pretty accurate. You'll get down to, you know, a yard. Some of them are not that accurate. You'll find some that are 2 or 3 yards off. We've actually done some comparisons side by side with a number of different lasers and brands at times, and they can be up to 5 yards off. So, you know, not a good tool to use for measuring a golf course when you're, you know, 5 yards off per shot. It could add up to be, you know, 100+ yards for the golf course. And then those again, consumer-based GPS units, the ones you might buy at a sporting goods store or a hunting store, where, you know, a couple $100, those are not going to be at that level of accuracy that we require. So as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, you know, that laser, that big yellow laser that's there, is one that many AGAs still have. It was issued to them probably close to 20 years ago. They still work if the battery life is there, but these are very accurate lasers. They're down to just a couple inches at a very long distance, I think up to 1,000 yards. You do typically need a reflector to use these correctly or well. They will hit other, you know, they will hit a person or they will hit a tree, but really a reflector is needed to do these the best way. And then the GPS unit there that's to the bottom right, that's a pretty high-end unit. That's a Trimble unit that runs about $6,000 retail. They have been coming down in price, which is why more and more AGAs are using GPS. Some of them are down to as little as a few $1,000s, maybe $2,000 or $3,000. So I think we're up to maybe a quarter of the associations out there, quarter of the AJs that are using GPS, and I'm sure that grows by the day. But definitely you don't want to use something you buy at the sporting goods store to measure a golf course. All right, one more slide here. All right, so the other thing you need to know as you measure a golf course is where to start. You know, where do you start measuring the hole? The end of the hole is easy because that's going to be the center of the green. But where to start the hole is where we have a little bit of subjectivity, but in general, and then again, this is from the course rating manual, permanent markers are to reflect an average placement of the movable tee markers. You know, it doesn't mean that those tees are going to be at that position every day or all the time. They're going to move backwards, they're going to move forward, but that permanent marker should really represent the average placement of those movable tee markers. Typically on a single tee pad where a single tee marker is located, you're going to go to the center. The center of that tee pad is going to be the permanent marker, going to be where the average is going to lie. There will be some exemptions or exceptions to that where maybe the permanent marker is towards the back of the tee pad, or maybe it's towards the front. Maybe they want to give a little bit of room to move a second tee marker on there occasionally when they have bad weather or something like that. So, but that's something that can be worked out, with the course while the course is measured. But this does maximize the ability to use the entire tee pad and does reflect the average placement of that tee marker. But more and more commonly, you'll see multiple tee markers on a single pad. Most courses don't have an individual tee pad for every single tee marker. They might have, one big one there where the white and the blue, or the white and the gold are on the same tee pad, and maybe the red is on a separate one. But when there are multiple tee markers on a tee pad, it is recommended to use percentages and midpoints to determine the marker placement. And at no time should that marker be less than 2 yards from the front or 4 yards from the back of the teeing area. So I'm sure everybody who's been to a golf course, who's played golf courses, have found some of those permanent markers that are really questionable in terms of the location. Sometimes they're literally on the very back edge of a tee pad. I've even seen tee markers or permanent markers that are in the rough behind a tee pad. So they're trying to really stretch that yardage out another 5 or 10 yards that will never be played to, but they want that number on the scorecard again. So really it's going to be at the midpoint, or in the case of a multiple tee marker, the midpoint of a portion of that tee pad. So I have an example here of a overhead of a few tee pads. The red and the gold have their own individual tee pads, so the center of those two tee pads are going to be a good spot for the measurement and the permanent marker. However, that back tee pad has both the whites and the blues on it. So the typical procedure is to divide that in half. So take 50% of that tee pad, and then you divide each one of those halves in half again to get to the midpoint of those halves. So there might be 3 tee markers on a tee pad, and again, you're going to divide it into thirds, and then you're going to find the midpoint of each one of those. Again, that's not going to cover every single golf course. There's going to be some courses where maybe they always keep the forward tee on a tee pad at the very front of it, and the very back tee on the pad at the very back of it, and they move the one in the middle a lot more. Maybe the white tees have a 10 or 12 yard window where they move them forward and backwards, but the blues and the red tees only move a couple yards forward and backwards. So again, something that can be talked through with the golf course on their normal maintenance and placement. So on a straight hole, and this is typically going to be a par 3, but it can be a par 4. There are straight enough par 4s that are short enough that you can measure as if they're a par 3. What we're going to do is take a measurement from each tee marker to the front center and back center of the green, and then we're going to average those two numbers. So instead of actually having to find the center of the green, where a person would actually have to walk on the green and figure out where the center is, we just do it mathematically by taking the average of the front and the back of the green. It's a much quicker and more accurate way to do it. So looking at the next slide here, and these are some older slides that we've used for years, but these are kind of not real holes. These are kind of drawn up through some PowerPoint tools. But from that tee marker, you're going to go to the front edge of the green. You're going to take that measurement there, which in this case is 150 for the men, and what would be 120 for the women if we were going to use a similar tee pad for them. And then to the very back of the green, that measurement is 170 for the men and 140 for the women. So this hole from the permanent markers to the center of the green is going to be 160 yards for the men and 130 yards for the women, which is mathematically the average of the two. So really simple to measure par threes. There's just typically, a couple measurements needed, and then, the team can move on. Again, this can be used for par four holes as well, up to a certain distance. Anything over probably 350 or more, you might not be able to get a measurement all the way to the front edge of the green with a laser. With a GPS unit, you should be able to do that. There's no reason why you couldn't. But again, it has to be a pretty straight hole to do that. Any hole that has any type of bend or dogleg to it should not be measured directly from the tee all the way to the green. It has to have an intermediate point, and even some long holes that are straight, 400, 500, 600 yards at times. More than likely, you're going to have some sort of intermediate spot to stop off for either the laser or even a GPS. So the more important thing to get right with measuring is dogleg holes. Dogleg holes do have a little bit of subjectivity. Where is that pivot point? So we do need to be consistent with where we measure the hole to and through that pivot point. But as it says here, a hole with a dogleg must be measured on a straight line from each permanent marker to the center of the fairway at the pivot point. And then the measurement must continue from that point on a straight line to the center of the green or the next pivot point if applicable. So we'll go through a couple of examples here to show you this, but one thing you'll note that the word center, some people might be wondering if that's misspelled, but that's the international English spelling of center. So as this is a world handicap system and a world course rating system along with it, everything we do is based on international English. So there's going to be a few terms that you're going to see in course rating and handicapping that might not be what you see in everyday, American English, I should say. So looking at another hole again, kind of a drawn up hole here. This is a hole obviously with a dog leg. So when we measure this hole, we're going to take the permanent marker out to the pivot point. In this case, the natural pivot point is around 230 yards from the tee for the men and would be 190 yards for the women, scaled down. So that's our first measurement. We're not going to go straight to the green. We're not going to go to the very back of this fairway. We're not going to go all the way where that bunker is on the right. We're going to find a natural pivot point in this hole, and that's going to be our first stopping point. And then we're going to go from there to the center of the green. And again, we would still do that front of the green, back of the green, and then average them. But for this example, we're just showing to the middle. But this is where it's important to know how a hole's measured, because if you were rating this hole for a scratch golfer, for men or women, they obviously hit the ball more than 230 for the men or 190 for the women. So then you have to determine, are they cutting off some distance by cutting the dog leg? Are they having to add distance to the hole because they can't hit the ball past the pivot point? So this is where it's important to know as a course rater how the holes are measured, so that when you do make those adjustments for dog legs, that you're making the adjustment correctly. So I've seen sometimes, or it's not uncommon, I should say, for a hole to be measured by cutting the dog leg. And then the rating team goes out there and assumes that by cutting the dog leg, they cut even more yards off of it, not knowing that the measurement was actually done that exact same line of play. And now it makes the rating a little bit lower than it should be. So it is important to know how the hole was measured for it to be properly rated under dog leg adjustment, which we'll get to later. So in this case, the hole winds up being 380 yards for the men, 340 for the women by adding those two values together. Now, this is a par 5 hole, or a hole with 2 pivot points, double dog leg you can call it. We would take that measurement from, again, the permanent marker out to that first pivot point, even if it's under 250. We don't want to go beyond the pivot point for measuring, because again, we're kind of encroaching on, beyond where a dog leg adjustment would be applied. And then 200 yards equivalent for the women, going to the next pivot point, because again, the player cannot go straight at the green on this second shot. They're not going to be able to go over those trees, over the water to the green. So this hole does require a secondary measurement in the middle, which is 200 yards from pivot point to pivot point. And then from that pivot point to the green is another 150. So again, not a lot of double dog legs out there, but on some long holes, some par 5s, you might have them. In this case, we add all 3 numbers up, and it winds up being a 590-yard hole for the men and 550 for the women. But again, as rating this hole, the players may play this hole slightly different. They may cut a dog leg. They may have to, lay up or hit less than a full shot to avoid going through a dog leg. So again, important to know. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more subjective and a little bit more difficult to measure is if the pivot point is not easily discernible, where there's not a visible or an obvious pivot point. What we do then is we select a pivot point that is approximately 250 for the men or 210 for the women from the most commonly played set of tee for each gender. So we do want to factor in that, you know, if the white tees or the blue tees for men, we're going to go to 250. We're going to go to a spot that's 250 from those tees. But if the most commonly played tee for women is a red tee or a gold tee, we're going to go 210 from that tee. We're not going to go 250 from every tee. So in that case, what we have is a hole where there is no real obvious pivot point. This is one of those holes where you can kind of bite off as much as you want on the tee shot. We have to be realistic though. So from maybe the most commonly played set of tees on that line of play, that measurement's 210. You know, that's realistic. You know, a scratch golfer at 170 for the women can safely carry it, but we're not maxing them out. If I went any farther to the left, you know, took a more aggressive line, and now that water hazard, that penalty area is now close to 220 or 180, now we're getting to the point where, you know, the scratch golfer may not be able to safely carry it. So we want to go on a line of play that gets the scratch golfer not only a safe carry, but gets them to the middle of the fairway on their normal full shot, 250 for men, 210 for women. We definitely wouldn't want to go farther to the right or down the hole and make that, you know, excessively long, because then you're going to have to just adjust it anyways when you rate the hole. So really, we base most measurements on scratch golfers because we want to do as little adjusting to the dogleg force layup category as we have to. So by using the scratch golfer as our basis for measuring, it means that our measurements are going to be good for the scratch golfer as we rate the course as well. And then and then 140 yards from that point into the green. So this hole winds up being, you know, 390 for the men and 350 for the women. But this last hole is one that, you know, again, no real clear pivot point. So what we do then is we find a spot that's 250 roughly or 210 for the women from the tee and use that as our pivot point. You know, you could realistically say the pivot point is anywhere along, probably within a 20 or 30 yard, you know, radius of this spot. But because we have these standardized distances, 250 and 210 for scratch, we're going to go out to that point and becomes the pivot point to measure the hole. Again, this means that when you rate the hole, you don't have to worry about any type of adjustments for scratch because that pivot point is exactly where they typically hit the ball, at least from the most commonly played set of tees. Okay, and then elevation changes. We do want measurements to always be done on a horizontal basis, so we're taking any type of elevation changes out of the equation. Using GPS equipment will do that automatically. It will actually not correct, it'll give you the actual horizontal distance and not inflate it due to any uphill or downhill holes. Lasers will, you know, get you a slightly inflated distance if you go up a hill or down a hill because it's not the true horizontal distance. So as it says, this means that the line of sight uphill or downhill must be corrected to horizontal distances. Now, you know, when I say this, it's usually not a very big factor. In most cases, it probably doesn't even need to be corrected at all. But if it's a significant elevation change, especially on shorter shots, you might have to do some adjustment. This is really more, you know, in the, you know, realm of the course measurers and not the course raters. So when we look at a hole like this, you know, it's a 100-yard par 3 hole. It's actually 100 yards on that upslope. So from the tee to the middle of the green on line C is 100 yards. But we really want to get the measurement, which is line A, which is the horizontal distance between the green and the middle of the green and the tee. Obviously, when we rate this hole, we're going to rate it with, you know, 30 feet uphill elevation, which is going to add distance to the effective playing length. So we don't want to bump that up twice by saying we're going to use the longer measurement and we're going to use a plus 30 uphill elevation change. Because the measurements in yards, I converted the uphill elevation change into yards as well, which is 10 yards. And you know, not to take you back to your school days with math, but the Pythagorean theorem, you know, it's really easy to figure out what A is if you know C and B. So C and B are 10 yards and 100 yards respectively. We put those into the formula and it winds up being, as you can see, a very minimal impact on the actual measurement. So if the measurement up the hill is 100 yards, the horizontal measurement is 99.4, which in this case would round slightly down to 99. So really just a 1 yard difference on a hole like this, which isn't necessarily a flat hole, not a very flat hole at all, actually a 30 foot increase on a 100-yard shot would be very noticeable. But again, only 1 yard difference in the measurement. However, on a downhill hole, they typically have much more elevation change. It's much easier to go downhill a significant distance than uphill. So what we have on the next slide is a fairly large drop. If I can get there, my mouse seems to be stuck here, but I don't know what happened here. Hey, Matt, can you move this forward at all? I can't move the slide forward. All right, there we go. Okay, so this one is a 100-yard shot, again, down the hill on line C, but it's a 90-foot drop, 30 yards or 90 feet down. We plug that into the formula, and as you can see, it makes a 5-yard, roughly a 5-yard difference in the actual measurement. So this hole would be a 95-yard measurement from tee to green, not the 100 that the laser might have shown on the display. So again, this is not something that the raters really need to worry about. This is more only for those people who actually measure courses, and most of them, if they're using GPS, they don't have to worry about it. If they're using lasers, they're either used to doing this, or this is, again, very extreme. I would be hard pressed to say there's a lot of holes that are 100 yards long and 90 feet drop. As that distance gets longer, as the shot length gets longer, that elevation makes less and less impact on the corrected length. So a 400-yard hole with this same 90-foot drop would not be nearly as off as this short hole in terms of the 95 over 100. So, okay. Questions? Anything pop up, John, about measuring?
Yes, got a couple of questions came in. First one here, I believe you're going to address this later in the presentation, but should pivot points at altitude be adjusted for the course elevation?
That's a really good question. So, for not everybody here probably knows this, but at elevation, we're going to talk about it in a little bit. The scratch golfer's distance is actually increased. It goes from 250 for the men up to, as much as like 280 or 282, I think is the top table value. And women scratch the same. We've never changed our text in the book to say that you have to adjust for altitude. So my gut answer is no, just still use the 250. But that's something I really do have to check with our committee and kind of see if that's something we might need to think about for the future, that at altitude, that pivot point might need to be a little bit farther down the hole than it would be at sea level. So that's why we do these webinars. We get to hear these type of questions. So.
Great. Another question regarding the hole with the forced carry over water off the tee. What happens for the bogey golfer in that rating? For example, if the bogey golfer cannot reach the pivot point on the fairway.
Yeah, so, and we'll get to that as well under dogleg forced layup, but we do use the scratch for the basis for measuring a hole, but obviously on a hole like that, the bogey golfer couldn't take that same line of play. So they would have to play the ball with a different line of play, a safer line of play, maybe on that hole that I showed way to the right, kind of down towards the bottom. So then we'd have a dogleg adjustment for the bogey. So, but we'll get into that here in about probably 15 or 20 minutes.
Perfect. And just one more quick question before we go to the next section. Could a course be measured from green to tee if the appropriate measurements are done?
So repeat that again, John?
Could a course be measured from green to tee if appropriate measurements are done?
Yep, absolutely. And in fact, a lot of par threes, that's the way it's done. So instead of having to shoot from each tee marker to the front of the green and then move up to the next tee and do the same thing, you actually stay at the green and shoot backwards, because then you only have to move once. You get your back of the green measurement, and then when you move to the front of the green, you just get all of your tee markers from that front of the green, and you just do subtract the difference in the yardages. So, but on par fours and par fives, you typically don't do it that way, because you kind of want to see the hole as it's played for pivot points and things like that. So, okay. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt here, and he's going to take you through roll and elevation. And Matt, I think you probably want to talk about all 5 EPLs just as an opening here.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. And great conversation, Scott, and great job of explaining measuring a golf course. The first, all the EPLs that you saw listed there prior, and I'll jump back to the full list there of roll, elevation, dogleg, force layup, wind, and altitude. Really measuring each golf course's tee sets is very important to the final calculation, as for course rating and slope rating, as Scott pointed out. It drives a big part of the rating. Outside of that measurement of each tee set, these effective playing length factors also make a golf course either play longer or shorter, just depending on which ones we're looking at. For example, roll, we're evaluating if the landing zone, we are gaining more or less than the normal 15 to 25 yards of roll. Elevation-wise, uphill holes are played longer than level holes. Downhill holes play shorter. A correction is required with elevations of teeing area to the green that differ by 10 feet or more, either plus or minus. Dogleg and forced layups, in both situations, may add yardage and change the effective length of a hole, but a dogleg may also subtract yardage, like Scott described, cutting that dogleg based on the measurement that was prescribed there. A scratch player playing a more aggressive line, for example. Those length corrections are evaluated separately for each scratch and bogey player. Wind that you see there, the fourth one, it's a length correction for wind that should be based on the average daytime wind speed during the mid-season. A typical course rater does not analyze this on a hole-by-hole level, but rather your team leader, captain, or golf association staff inputs this information into the database and is calculated on a 9-hole basis. Altitude, sort of the same as wind. It's calculated at 2,000 or at greater than 2,000 feet above sea level. Corrections are must be made to the effective playing length of the course, to the location of landing zones, into the length of the approach shots, because golf shots travel farther in the thinner air. Like Scott had mentioned, like Denver, Colorado, for example, shots play longer just because of where they sit at, based on sea level, right? A course rater does not analyze this on a hole-by-hole level, but rather your team leader, captain, AGA staff member inputs this information into the database. So the first one we're going to cover today is roll. So roll. Adjustments for roll are evaluated on full tee shots and subsequent full shots for the scratch and bogey player. We assume, and this is key, we assume that there will be 15 to 25 yards of roll on each full shot. Now you see there the in parentheses driver and a full 3-wood. The reason for that commentary is because we don't measure roll on full shots from 6 or 7 irons, because those shots are more based on accuracy is the premium, whereas full 3-woods, gaining more distance toward the next landing zone on longer holes is the premium. That's why we say the full 3-wood, you hit your next shot based on the shot lengths that we talk about in the beginning of the guide for scratch and bogey players. For a bogey male player, we talk about 200 yards full shot off the tee after roll, and then 170 are those full shots that we're referring to when it comes to that. Factors that will affect your roll will include the fairway slope or tilt. Obviously, balls that are hit to a downhill landing zones roll farther than ones that are hit into upslopes. The fairway firmness. Soft fairways, if there's perpetually in a particular fairway in a low-lying area, if it's very wet or damp, obviously balls are not going to roll as far. Whereas if it's certain areas and certain fairways, they're always bone dry. For mid-season conditions, you're going to see that those firm fairways are going to gain more access than that 15 to 25 yards that we talk about on full shots. Landing zones not cut to fairway height. What you also see when we talk about how roll is affected is when ball lands in rough, as maybe the bogey player, for example, does not have the length from the championship tees to carry to the start of the fairway. Obviously, if that bogey player, whether it's men or women, can't get to the start of the fairway and they land in rough, that's going to affect their normal 15 to 25 yards of roll that we talk about, right? So that's where we talk about, landing zones not cut to fairway height may affect the overall roll of the ball. We'll continue. So this, if you have your guides, great, that you can refer to. This is, if you don't, no big deal. We will go through some examples here, but just wanted to give you, this is what the roll table guide as well as the adjustments look through here. Now, as you can see from the guide description, the baseline to view off the roll table is that tee shot roll. That's where we're going to start the conversation with roll. So on our tee shot, is it a minor slope, uphill or downhill? Is it significant slope, uphill, downhill, etc.? And you can see the point values associated with each category of uphill and downhill, plus and minus. Obviously, if we're adding length to the hole, meaning uphill, that's where we're going to see the pluses, meaning the ball isn't rolling that normal 15 to 25. So we're adding distance. That's why the plus. And then obviously on the opposite side, the downhill, if it's a moderate downhill slope, we're shortening the hole because it's gaining more distance toward our final destination, which is the center of the green. So that's why we say that's minus distance there. As you can see from the guide description, like I said, we're assuming this baseline off the tee shot roll rating table. In course rating, like I mentioned earlier, we are assuming the normal roll of 15 to 25 yards. Each point that you see on this roll rating table in general represents plus or minus 5 yards on top of what I've already assumed. So, minor slopes, uphill and downhill, they are respectively 1, either plus or minus. So we're adding or subtracting 5 yards of roll. As we get to moderate, we're plus or minusing 10 yards and on down the chart there, or down the table. For those of you who are newer to course rating, you see at the bottom of the page there, adjustments, right? And these are for those nuances in course rating, right? You're not always going to be able to fit each rating table or EPLs, or for later in the webinar series, obstacle factors that perfectly fit into a box every single time. That's where adjustments come in, and certainly leaning on your captains, your AGA staff, your veteran course raters that you go out with. They'll certainly be able to help you, guide you through as to what constitutes minor, moderate, or significant or extreme, right? The adjustments are within each EPL and obstacle factor, allow course raters to apply more or less points if they're seeing these nuances during a rating. So we have an F adjustment that's for soft and firm fairway conditions. If they gain or gain excessive loss of roll or gain excessive roll, pluses or minuses can be attained, as well as what we call a 2 adjustment is if subsequent to those full tee shots that we talked about, we're gaining less than the normal 15 to 25 per shot, or gaining more than the 15, 25 than that we are assuming. That's where those plus and minus ones come into play here. So we're going to go over just a quick roll example here, a couple of them, if you will. And really what they're going to do is just sort of walk you through how you assess roll for particular holes. So I've got 2 landing zones here, one for the bogey and one for the scratch, both in yellow and white and yellow respectively. The course rating team determines a downhill moderate slope in the normal landing zones for both the scratch and bogey player. So you'll see that, the normal landing zones are as such, but with the red arrows, you're gaining more distance toward your final destination, which is the green, obviously involved. That's the final destination for any player. So how would we, on our forms, as a course rating team, show this for a specific hole? Right? How do we display this so that, when the AGA staff inputs this into the database, they can calculate the appropriate course ratings and slope ratings respectively? So on the left side here, you see on the right-hand side of the screen, you see that roll section, right? And then you see 2 boxes left and right of those. For those of you who are newer, the left box represents the scratch value, and the bogey player is represented by the right there. And you can see, based on a moderate slope, if you have that in front of you, those are both -2 values. That's what you get for a moderate downhill slope. We're gaining distance toward that green. So that's why we have a -2. Now you notice that I also talked about this affects the length of the hole in general by, for each point by 5 yards per point, right? So when we get to our green target section, which is it for a future webinar, this will also be adjusted, right? So if our normal approach shots based on the length of the hole and what we know are the baselines for normal tee shot lengths for scratch and bogey, we are saying our approach shot lengths originally for scratch and bogey. For scratch, it was 70 yards. For bogey, it was 120. But we know that we actually gain distance toward the center of the green. So those 70s and 120s, we talk about for every point there's 5 yards. So we're talking about 10 yards total. We're going to deduct 10 yards from each because we're gaining distance toward the center of the green. And that's why you see those 70s and 120s become 60 and 110. Another example that I have for roll, normal tee shot landing zone for scratch is that the course rating team determines that the bogey landing zone is level and an uphill significant slope in the normal landing zone for scratch. So no need to really worry right now if you have the guide in front of you about the bogey. We're really looking at the scratch landing zone. We see that we're moving backwards because of that significant uphill slope in the normal scratch landing zone. So that's the adjusted tee shot landing zone where we will then take our values from. So then from there, our roll values are 0 for that scratch player, or excuse me, for the bogey player, and that's because that their normal landing zone is determined as level. That's what the team determined. So you saw that level landing zone is equal to 0. That's what we're going to put on this hole, and then we're going to put a +3 roll for the scratch player because we're adding length to the hole. As I mentioned earlier, each point is worth about 5 yards. So we have 3 points there. So if we have a normal approach shot on this hole for scratch and bogey at 62 and 112 yards respectively, we know that we didn't do any changes to the bogey player, so that 112 will stay the same, but we're going to add 15 yards to that scratch player because 3 points times 5 is 15 yards. That becomes 77, right? Any questions, John, on the roll that I just described?
Sure, a couple of questions, Matt. First off, the normal tee shot value assumes 20 yards of original roll, correct?
Yeah, so yeah, obviously that's the average. That's what we, that's the average between 15 and 25, but certainly want to, beyond that, obviously now, of course, they're built the same. So we that 20 yards, yes, we assume 20 yards of roll. That's the average between the 15 and the 25. Anything outside of that, certainly that 15 or 25, that's what we're looking beyond for, minor slopes, moderate slopes, etc.
Great. And one other question here. Does grass type come into effect in determining roll values?
Can you repeat that question, John?
Sure. Yeah. Does grass type come into effect in determining roll values?
That's a very good question. Nothing is, certainly the conditions of the golf course will play a part in that. Roll wise, traditionally in your warm, cold, we don't look at that necessarily all too often, but certainly it can be taken into consideration if a certain grass type is a little bit longer than normal, then certainly that can be applied to it. But typically you don't see that too often, as fairways are cut pretty much in general, whether it's public golf courses pretty consistent or resort or private pretty consistently through the golf course, so you can get a really good determination as to what that roll will be.
Yeah, I'll add some to that, Matt. So, we have looked at that in the past, and there are going to be some sort of, some types of turf grass that result in slightly less roll than others. But unless it gets outside the 15 to 25 window, we're not going to make an adjustment. If it does get outside that, then you could use the firm adjustment, whether it's firm or soft, as kind of a a 1-point adjustment up or down to account for that. It's kind of similar that if the turf itself or the ground itself was firm or hard, if the turf grass itself is causing the ball to roll less or more than 15 to 25 yards, an adjustment could be made.
That's a great point, Scott. I'm using the that F adjustment that's there. So I will go ahead and continue on, John. Elevation, right? So I talked about elevation earlier, and obviously uphill holes play longer than level holes, downhills play shorter. So that correction needs to be made for elevation from the teeing area to the center of the green. Sort of like what Scott talked about in measurements. This is where that double dipping he was talking about plays into effect. So, obviously uphill holes play longer than level holes. Downhill holes play shorter. A correction is required when elevations of the teeing area and the green differ by 10 feet or more. Record the elevation differences between teeing area and green in feet, and we're going to round it to the nearest 10 feet as we talk, as you'll see here in some of the examples. The reasons why we round it to 10 feet, one, it has to be at least 10 feet. You can't say get an elevation of 8 feet, either plus or minus 8 feet, and then round up. We need it to be at least 10 feet or more in order to get something to put down on our form for course rating. Reasons as, obviously elevations, whether you're using GPS or an altimeter, sometimes they can be a little fickle, and we want to make sure that, something hits at least the benchmark, of that 10 feet, so that, that will really start to impact the overall effective playing length of that tee set, for example. So we want to make sure we get to at least 10 feet before we actually type anything in. 9 feet is the equivalent of 0 feet when we talk about course rating. So for example, on the right side of the screen there, you see an example of a digital altimeter. They come in all shapes and sizes. There's also apps out there, free ones that cost money. Certainly when it comes to altimeters, you can buy expensive ones, you can buy inexpensive ones. There's wide ranges. So if that's a route you want to go towards, certainly do so with that. So for example, when we talk about rounding holes, if a hole is 25 feet uphill from tee to green, we're going to record plus 30, adding to the effective playing length, right? That's what we're going to write down on our form, and that's going to be what's recorded and what's put into the database by your AGA staff member. We're going to round plus, we're going to round, normal rounding procedures, 15 for 25 for this example. If it ends at 5 or more, we're going to round up. 4 or less, we're going to round down. If the hole is 15 feet downhill from tee to green, we're going to record minus 20. Obviously, we're subtracting from the playing length of the hole. If the hole is 8 feet uphill from tee to green, we're going to record a 0, like I mentioned earlier. One of the rules of course rating, elevation must at least be 10 feet in order to qualify. On par 4s and 5s, there's no limit in uphill and downhill for what a plus or minus elevation can be. But note, which is also written in the guide, that the maximum elevation value that may be assigned on a par 3 hole is plus or minus 40, regardless of whether the bogey player can reach the center of the green in one shot. And we'll certainly talk through an example here shortly regarding elevation. So let's go through an example here on elevation. I've got a par 4 hole, right? The teeing area is set at 500 feet. The center of the green is set at 435. What is the final elevation value, right? So I've got a difference between those two numbers of minus 65 feet, we're starting at a higher ground and ending at a lower ground at the green. So our rounded answer for this would be minus 70. That's what we're going to put on our form when we're noting on this particular par 4. Now, obviously, the elevation tee to green there, that's what's listed on the form. We're going to write minus 70. And you'll notice in this example, there's only one, I'll say, bigger box than the two split boxes that we saw in roll. The reason is both the scratch and bogey player for a certain tee set are starting and ending at the same location, right? So regardless if I'm a scratch player or a bogey player playing the gold tees, I'm still starting at the same elevation, the same tee set, the same starting line. I'm ending at the same finish line, which is the center of the green. And so that's where we get that answer of, well, it's going to be the same for both players. That's why in roll, it won't necessarily be the same, for scratch and bogey, because we're hitting to different distances, and, the features of the fairway may dictate differently when we move ahead. So that's why we only have the one value for elevation for a particular tee set, and that's key, particular tee. As you move from the white tee to the red tee to the gold tee to the green tee, they may fluctuate, but the same value for the scratch and bogey player at each of the tee sets, the white, the red, the gold, the green, etc., will all be the same for those players. Okay, certainly a next example here, a unique example. We've got a player hitting down to a very, very low-lying green there. So we have a par 3 hole. The teeing area sits at 4,400 feet. The center of the green is at 3,700 feet. What is the final elevation value? So we have a difference there as we calculate of 700 feet, right, downhill, minus 700, right? So what are we going to list on our form there for this particular hole? Remember that notation that the maximum elevation value that may be assigned to a par 3 hole is plus or minus 40, regardless of whether the bogey player can reach the green in one shot, right? So the elevation there is minus 40. Now, why do we have that reason of the plus or minus 40s? Because the scratch player, for example, in this example here is what we're looking at. And really, at certain points, in this example, you'll see that, after 40 feet, the ball, more or less based on testing the handicap research team has done, is that the ball just continues to fall as opposed to gain distance, through the air. It's more or less gravity is taking over after 40 feet. And so that's why you see the 40 as your threshold on par 3 holes, regardless if the bogey player can reach the green in one shot. So that's why we have that capped at minus 40 or plus 40 for those for elevation. It's just more of a falling effect after a while than it is an actual losing or gaining distance. So our last example here that I'll have before I'll pass it back over to Scott. I've got a par 4 hole that's sitting at 2,156 feet. The center of the green sits at 2,178 feet, right? What is my final elevation value? The difference, the actual calculated difference is plus 22 feet, but I'm going to round that down to 20, plus 20. And so what I'm going to record on my form is plus 20. Notice that I wrote on the form the plus 20. I always like doing that just to avoid the confusion, as writing only 20 without that plus sign may cause some confusion for the end person that inputs it into the database. So just me being overly cautious is putting that plus 20 with my pencil to paper as the rationale as to why we show plus 20 on there. So, John, any last questions before I pass it over to Scott for the final the final 3 EPLs?
A couple of questions, Matt. First off, would you just be able to clarify again how the rounding takes place in the elevation changes?
Sure. So the first threshold is it has to get to at least plus or minus 10. So if I get a recorded value from the difference between the teeing area, or the tee set, I should say, to the center of the green, if it comes at 9 feet or plus 9 feet or minus 9 feet, that is 0. It has to at least get to 10 feet. So that's the first threshold. If I have something that says plus or minus 14, meaning the difference between the tee set and the center of the green is plus or minus 14 feet, that gets rounded to plus or minus 10, right? That 14. If it happens to be plus or minus 15 feet or plus or minus 25 feet, for example, then that gets rounded up to plus or minus 30 feet. You know, that 25 is beyond it. So we would round up to plus 25 or minus or plus 30 or minus 30 for those examples. So that's where the rounding takes place. Normal rounding. If it's a 4, we're going to round, back down toward the 0, toward 0, if you will. We're going to round up. We're going to round if we're at 5 or greater for on either side of 0. We're going to round to that. In the example I gave in 25, we're going to round plus 25 rounds to plus 30, minus 25 rounds to minus 30.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. One other question we had come in a couple of times during that section. Just to reiterate, is the elevation rating based on the tee to green elevation change or from landing zone to green?
It's from your starting point where you started from, the tee set to the center of the green. When we talk about the fairway elevation to the center of the green, if you will, that gets covered in the topography section, which is the next webinar series. That's where that gets allocated. So when we talk about elevation, we are strictly talking about, in this particular section where it talks about elevation, we're literally just talking about the starting point, which is the tee set, and the ending point, which is the green. So
perfect. Thanks, Matt.
Scott, you are, it's all yours.
All right, so I'm back. I'm going to take you through the rest of the slides here, which we're going to cover dogleg, forced layup, wind, and then altitude to kind of wrap it up. Wind and altitude are pretty short, so dogleg, forced layup is the one we probably need to spend a good amount of time on here. So moving forward here, hopefully my slide works. There we go, dogleg, forced layup. So the definition of dogleg, forced layup is a measure of how much longer or shorter a hole plays because it has a bend, which either causes the player to lay up or hit it less than a full shot, or allowing the player to cut the corner, or because it has obstacles such as penalty areas, bunkers, etc., that cross the fairway where the player is forced to lay up. One thing that's fairly new to the system, I know most people on this webinar are new raters, but I know that there's a few names that have probably been doing this for 5+ years, is that we used to not have any limit, any minimum on an adjustment, but we did add a limit a couple of years back, actually 4 years back, about 10 yards is the minimum correction for a dog leg. So if you're going to put a dog leg adjustment into the Form 1, the minimum value is 10 yards plus or minus. On a forced layup, there's no minimum. It could be a 5-yard forced layup, it could be a 7-yard forced layup, but for a dog leg, it's got to be a minimum of 10. The rationale behind that is that because dog legs are somewhat subjective, that you're not, you could take a slightly more aggressive line, a slightly less aggressive line, and change that number a little bit. We really don't feel like anything under 10 yards is worth recording. So moving forward here, and just have an example right off the bat here where we have a hole that's a dog leg. Some people might recognize the hole if they've been fortunate enough to play here, which this is Pebble Beach, first hole. The pivot point, and this is based on the measurements. This is why it's important to know how holes are measured and why we covered measuring first, because this hole, as it was measured, would have been measured out to that pivot point, that 220 for the men, 180 for the women, where the hole shifts and goes a different direction, and it's another 180 yards to get to the middle of the green. So this hole was measured at 400 yards for men and 360 for women, but as you can see, the scratch golfer can hit the ball farther than the pivot point. So what do we do in this case? So the pivot point for the scratch golfer, or the scratch player, we've changed that term as well, is less than 250 for men, less than 210 for the women off the tee. So the subsequent shot plays longer than if this was a straight hole. If this was a dead straight hole, the scratch player would be able to hit a full tee shot and gain 250 yards or 210 for the women towards the center of the green. But because this hole turns, they're not able to gain that distance directly towards the center of the green. So therefore, we need to add the appropriate yardage for the scratch player. Now, how much do we add? That would depend on, how much farther past the pivot point can they get towards the center of the green. So if I add another line here, and if I say if they go beyond this pivot point in this hole, they're probably going to either hit the ball into the bunker or into the trees, but certainly beyond the fairway, and not really towards the hole. So even though they could hit a driver here, they could hit a full shot, it's not going to wind up in a good spot. And we don't assume players can move the ball around corners at will. We assume straight shots. So obviously a lot of players could hit if they're a right-handed player, a fade around the corner. If they're a lefty, kind of a hook around the corner. We don't assume that in course rating, because that's assuming players are probably even better than scratch at that point. So once they hit that pivot point, if they go any farther down the hole, they're really not gaining direct distance towards the green. In fact, they're probably putting themselves in a worse position. So in this hole, they're actually more than likely not hitting a driver. They're hitting something less than a driver. So we need to add yardage in this hole. In this case, we're going to figure out where is that pivot point from the center of the green. It's 180. How long is the hole? 400. So it's 220. So how much do they lose? Well, what's the difference between 220 and 250 for men, or 210 and 180 for women? Is 30 yards. So in this case, they have a 30-yard dogleg adjustment. To be specific, this is not a forced layup adjustment. There's nothing that says this player has to lay up, but it is the way that the hole is designed is causing them to play this hole longer than if this hole was straight. And that's kind of the essence of dog legs, is that it's requiring the player to either hit a shape shot or to hit something less than a full shot to kind of keep the ball, in play or straight. Now, if that distance beyond the pivot point on that dotted line continues to gain distance towards the green, even if it's only 50%. Let's say for every yard it goes past the pivot point, it gains half a yard towards the green, and the other half continues to go farther left. It doesn't have to be the full 30 yards in that case. It could be 15 yards or 20 yards. But due to the fact that there's a bunker right there just beyond the pivot point, would probably mean that player is going to hit something, that's about 30 yards short of a full shot. So there are a few factors that go into that decision. Now, the next hole is where a player can cut the dog leg. Now, again, this hole was measured based on that red line of play, where they measured out to the pivot point and then from the pivot point to the green. Now, why this becomes a factor sometimes is that, the measurement might have been done from, let's say, the most commonly played set of tees, which is the white tees. However, the tees in front of that are going to go out to the same pivot point. So if a scratch player played from the set of tees, they're probably not going to hit the ball to that same pivot point. If they played a next tee back, they probably would, because that's how the hole was measured. So again, why it's important to know how a hole's measured versus how it's rated. So in this case, the scratch golfer can safely carry those bunkers and get through that rough area. If it's very light rough, let's say, and play this hole shorter than it was measured. So the hole's measured at 400 for the men, 360 for the women, but they've cut the corner a bit and shortened that approach shot. So instead of having that normal 150-yard approach shot, maybe they only have a 130-yard approach shot because they've cut the corner. So now we're going to go ahead and put in a negative dogleg adjustment because the hole is playing shorter than the measured length. So in this case, we're going to use the minus 20. These are much less common than the other dogleg adjustments, which is adding yardage. But, again, from some of the shorter tees, the scratch golfer can cut corners, and this adjustment would be in play. But if the scratch golfer or the bogey golfer, but mostly the scratch, is cutting the corner on a standard set of tees, let's say your middle tees for men or your forward tee, whatever the tee you choose for women as your most common, more than likely that's how the hole was measured. So if this hole was measured along that yellow line of play where the scratch golfer was cutting the corner, you would have a 0 dogleg adjustment. So even though they're cutting the corner, if that's how the hole was measured, if it wasn't measured along the red line of play but along the yellow, then this hole becomes a 0 for scratch, and more than likely becomes a plus number for bogey, because bogey's going to have to take a less aggressive line because they can't carry those bunkers and play to the left and wind up with a longer shot to the green than they would have had if the hole was straight. So really the pivot point is going to determine whether it's a dogleg plus or a dogleg minus, but also it could be different for scratch than it is for bogey. it's not totally uncommon to have a minus value for scratch and a plus value for bogey, or vice versa. And then the other part of this category, which is forced layup, this occurs when there are obstacles, penalty areas, deep bunkers, etc., across the fairway, or reduces the fairway width in the normal landing zone to less than 15 yards for the men or less than 13 yards for the women. So this example obviously is where the penalty area crosses the entire fairway. There's no way to get over it, and you can't go around it. So this would be a true forced layup, but really a forced layup could be where if that fairway got to the point where it's only 9, 10, 12 yards wide, even though the player could theoretically hit it in there, so the water's not actually, it doesn't have to be carried, but it's on both sides of a fairway at 10 yards, like almost like a squeeze. It's 10 yards between the water on both sides in the fairway. That would be considered a forced layup. No sane player is going to try to hit the ball, between there, and have any type of success. So that becomes a forced layup by default. So as it says here, the largest dogleg forced layup value allowed on any single hole is plus or minus 50, and that's cumulative. So you could have a hole where there's multiple forced layups, or a dogleg and a forced layup on the same hole. If that total adds up to be more than 50, the maximum value recorded for course rating and into the course rating software is 50 yards. So really it's just to minimize the impact of an excessively large layup or dogleg or adjustment that may not actually be the case for the majority of people who actually play there. Again, this happens a lot of times on shorter set of tees where a scratch golfer is not going to play, but it could be a 70-yard layup for a scratch golfer from the forward set of tees. But because the fact that they don't play there, it seems kind of silly to put a 70-yard layup in the system when they're not going to be there anyway. So, and as it says, when a player is forced to lay up because of obstacles, generally assume they lay up 10 yards short of the obstacle. So we're not going to put the scratch golfer or the bogey golfer, 1 yard from the end of that fairway right in front of the penalty area. We're going to go at least 10 yards back in general, sometimes more. If this is a downslope, if the fairway's kind of tilted down towards the water, which is pretty common on holes with water, they want to drain the water, they want to drain the fairway. You may want to lay the player back a little bit more as a safe forced layup. If it's uphill or if there's heavy rough, right there, you could potentially go closer, but 10 yards is pretty much the minimum. We really don't want to get closer to the obstacle that we're laying up from by less than 10 yards. It's the old adage is if you're going to lay up, lay up. Don't try to risk it by going as close as you can, and course rating is the same way. So throwing a quick example in here on the same exact hole, let's say that water, it's a penalty area, but it's water by definition in the real world, is 230 yards from the tee for the men or 190 to the water for the women to get to that water penalty area. So what's happening is we already have a forced layup due to the fact that they can't hit a full tee shot. So their normal tee shot of 250 for men or 210 for women is going to put them in the water. So now we're going to go back another 10 yards from where the end of the water, where the end of the fairway was. So in that case, we're going to go a full 30 yards back from where their normal full shot would have been. So it's 20 yards short just to reach the water or the penalty area, and another 10 yards on top of that to stay safely short of the penalty area. So now we're going to have a total adjustment for scratch in this case of plus 30. So, and again, the bogey may or may not have a forced layup, probably not in this case, because they're going to wind up 50 yards or 60 yards for women short of the scratch, and then they're going to have to carry this penalty area on their next shot, but there doesn't look like they have to lay up due to it. So again, you could have a forced layup for one player and not the other, or vice versa. And then this isn't really part of the effective playing length categories in terms of it doesn't have an impact on the effective length of the course, but we also have a procedure in the system which is layup by choice. And this is where obstacles near the normal landing zone result in the player choosing to hit less than a full shot. So it's not a forced situation. The last example was a forced situation. They don't have a choice. They can't hit a full shot or they'll wind up in that water. But if the fairway gets fairly narrow or there's a very tight landing zone with some hazards, maybe a bunker or a heavy rough on one side that's really tight to the fairway, that could be a case for a forced layup by choice. As it says here, a fairway landing zone less than 15 yards for the men or less than 13 for the women without severe obstacles may be a reason for layup by choice. So if you get a hole where the fairway narrows down to 12 yards, and maybe there's just, light bunkers on both sides, or maybe just, medium rough, 3 to 4 inch rough, not terrible, but not great, that might be a reason for a layup by choice. But it's certainly not a forced layup. Nothing's saying the player has to lay up in that case. And you definitely don't record a value under the forced layup category when it's a by choice situation. No adjustments made out of the dog leg. However, the approach shot is then going to be adjusted based on the layup by choice distance, and other adjustments may apply. As anybody who's rated, courses knows that there's a layup adjustment under fairway, there's a layup adjustment under R&R. So these adjustments would apply, not always, because the fairway one might depend on how many other landing zones there are. So, and then the last thing about layup by choice, and this is an important one, is that there may be situations where the overall layup is a combination of forced layup and layup by choice. There are times when, laying back 10 yards from the end of short of an obstacle, let's say it's again a penalty area, puts the player in a really bad spot. Let's say it puts them on like slightly down slope, or maybe a awkward lie, it's side hill lie, narrower fairway, not an ideal place to be. We still don't make the forced layup any farther back. We're going to say to stay short of that obstacle, to stay short of the penalty area, 10 yards short of it accomplishes that goal. They're not in the penalty area. Anything beyond that becomes a choice. So if 10 yards farther back from that becomes a nice level fairway, it's maybe another 10 yards wide, probably something where a player would say, hey, if I'm going to lay up, I might as well lay up 20 yards short of the penalty area versus 10. Only 10 of that's forced. The other 10 is a choice, because again, if the player happens to hit not a full shot, but the shot up to the 10-yard distance short of the obstacle, they're still safe. This forced layup is only what keeps them short of going into that obstacle. Anything beyond that becomes a choice. Okay. Moving forward here. I guess if I get stuck on a slide too long, it doesn't let me advance. Matt, can you advance that by chance to the next slide? I think we're almost done anyways. We might actually be done.
Yeah, Scott, I believe our next slide is a questions block.
Yeah, so we'll take questions if I'll figure out how to advance the slide here. There we go. One back. Too far. So any questions pop up, John?
Yeah, actually, would we be able to, if you can, just jump back to 2 slides to the forced layup, if you could?
Sure. Matt, are you able to do that, or am I able to do that? One more. There we go.
There we go. Perfect. Yeah, so we had a question come in. How close to the landing zone does an obstacle need to be to cause a forced layup? And the example is, what if the water is at 210 yards or 215 yards from the women's tee?
Okay, so the end of the fairway, or where the water starts, is 215, so it's 5 yards past their normal full shot. They would still have to lay up a minimum of 5 yards to so if they hit the ball 210, they're within 5 yards of the penalty area. They would have to lay back up a minimum of 5 more yards to say they're going to hit the ball 205, so that they're 10 yards short of the obstacle. Does that make sense? Or does that answer the question, John, that as you interpret it?
Yes, so if the water is at 210 for the women, it would be a 10-yard forced layup.
Yep. Yeah. So if the water's right at 210, it doesn't mean they can hit a full tee shot. They still have to play 10 yards short of that, so they can only hit the ball 200. So it's a 10-yard forced layup in that case. So.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Another question we had come in was regarding the measurements with cutting the corner example. When a rating team goes to a site, how would they know which pivot point was used to measure the hole?
Yeah, well, again, that's why hopefully or ideally the association, the AGA, and the one to do the measurements, and they may want to note that in their, with the measurements so that the rating team is aware. But if not, it does sometimes take a little bit extra work where the rating team might have to do a quick shot out to the fairway with just a handheld laser. At that point, it's probably fine. Go to the pivot point, have somebody run out there with a cart, shoot and go, is this 230, is this 240, is this 250, whatever it happens to be. So Sometimes it does require a little bit of measuring by the rating team to determine whether or not the measurement itself was based on cutting the corner or not cutting the corner. So, but again, a measuring team should be able to provide that ahead of time. And also, you know, I don't want to recommend this, but it's an option, is Google Earth before you rate a course or after sometimes can be a good help with determining, you know, general information about like distances and stuff, but it's not always up to date. It's sometimes there's some little bit of error there. So I wouldn't recommend it as the best way to do it, but it's an option. So.
Perfect. And you just took my last question from me right there. Would you recommend using Google Earth to estimate dogleg adjustments or dogleg yardage?
You know, again, it's an option. It's not something we're going to say yes, use it, you know, at will. But if you're having a hard time, if it's a struggle to figure out where the dogleg, where the pivot point is, it's a lot easier to see the pivot point from above than it is from the ground. That's you know, looking at those slides that I showed, when you see a hole from above, it's pretty obvious where the pivot point is. But when you see it from ground level, sometimes it's not so obvious. So, you know, using it to kind of get that pivot point might be a good idea. And those associations that use GPS to measure sometimes can have reports that show where the pivot point was overlaid on top of Google Earth or a course map that might want to provide to the rating team. So, okay. So it doesn't sound like there's any more questions there. We'll move forward to wind. And like I said, these last two categories won't take long, so we should be wrapped up on time or maybe even a minute early. Wind is really something that a rater, a normal or not a non-captain rater, doesn't have to worry too much about. All we're doing with wind is making an adjustment based on the average daily wind speed at times when golf is played. It's a course-specific adjustment. It's not a hole-by-hole rating. So we're going to do it by nines. So front nine and back nine can potentially have different wind ratings, different wind adjustments. Maybe you have a course where the front nine is open and the back nine is through the trees. So it's possible, but most courses are going to have the same wind adjustment on both nines. But again, it's something that usually the AGA or the team captain, the team leader, is going to make a decision on, you know, what is the wind we're going to use for this particular course. Knowing that some of you on the call, you know, on this webinar are either team captains or maybe aspiring team captains, it's good to obviously know how this works. Typically, you want to find some reliable sources, whether it's, you know, websites, weather services, on what is the wind speed, general wind speed in that area. You got to be careful sometimes. We have a couple committee members that have done a lot of research on wind, and one of the things they always say is that a lot of these websites will base wind on 30 meters above the ground. So you're talking 100 feet off the ground is their wind speed measurement. So that's not where golf's played. You know, golf's not played 100 feet off the ground for the most part. So you got to take those with a grain of salt. But you know, this map here you can see on the screen, it was just a map I pulled off where it just shows general wind speed daily averages, and you can see that the greenish is less, the green and the yellow are less, the reds and the kind of the tans are more, and then as you get into the purples, that's the most. And just common sense, you know, most people know that West Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, you know, these are the places where wind is a pretty big factor. 10 to 15 to 20 mile an hour winds on a daily basis is not uncommon. When you get into the central southeast, Alabama, Mississippi, not a lot of wind most of the time, and Florida depends on whether you're coastal or not. California, the same thing. In the mountain states, it really is a little bit, you couldn't use a map like this in the mountain states because you got pockets of valleys and, you know, exposed areas, which could be very different than it is in other parts. So it's kind of hit or miss there. So, but in general, all you're doing is putting in a overall adjustment for wind. It's based on the wind speed, miles per hour. So as you can see here, as the wind gets higher or faster, that adjustment becomes bigger. The maximum is 198 yards per nine. So if you had a extremely windy golf course where the average wind speed was over 20 miles an hour, and there are a couple places that this is not uncommon. Puerto Rico's one, and a couple areas in the central Midwest, you know, Oklahoma, et cetera. You know, you're almost adding 400 yards to the total course length because this is 198 yards per nine. So it's pretty significant impact on the course rating. So just be very careful. Most people assume wind is higher than it is. Most people that live in an area, they go, oh, it's really windy here. It's probably 15 to 20. It's probably more like 10 to 15, you know, maybe at most. So just try to get some resources to get that information as opposed to just your gut feel or you're putting your finger up in the air with put some wind on it or some spit on it or something. But again, something that the AGA or the team leader is probably going to be doing anyways with a lot more experience. Okay, and then I'll shoot through both of these before we take questions, John, just because they're so quick. Altitude, again, is a course level adjustment for the most part. When I say that, altitude actually has two impacts on course rating. One is the overall effective playing length is shorter. Altitude never makes the course longer, it only makes it shorter. And it also has an impact on shot lengths. And that's where you would see this table on the bottom right where the ball, if at altitude, is going to go a little bit farther, we use different shot lengths to determine where our landing zones are for scratch, for both men and women, and for bogey, but only for the men. The female bogey golfer, we've determined through some research that doesn't gain enough extra distance at altitude to really make an adjustment to the shot lengths. But the overall course length is also adjusted. So at 2,000 feet or more above sea level, the course is going to play shorter just due to the thin air, just due to the fact that the ball is going to travel farther due to the thin air. As you can see, as the altitude goes up, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, et cetera, those shot lengths get longer, but also the impact on the effective playing length becomes more as well. So, and again, we like maps in course rating, but the map there at the bottom left kind of shows the general elevation. The dark greens are sea level up to, I don't know the scale there, but let's say up to 500 feet above sea level. Now you got some more lighter greens that are a little bit higher. The oranges get into the 3,000, 4,000 range, and then you get into the reds, kind of Western U.S., where upwards of 7,000, 8,000 feet. So, most people are very familiar with the altitude where they live, in their state, something that's readily available. I mean, you can get this information many different places. What is the altitude of a specific spot? Websites, Google Earth even has altitude or elevation, I should say, or altitude's it's tricky because the word elevation is what people use for elevation above sea level, but altitude is what we use for course rating. So, but once that's established, it's just put in as a number. So if the course is 4,000 feet above sea level, let's say it's in Salt Lake City, 4,000 feet goes into the system, adjusts that effective playing length accordingly. But then the rating team, when they're out in the golf course, is going to go for the scratch golfer, for men, 264 off the tee instead of 250, and for the scratch female golfer, they're going to go 222 instead of 210. So it is going to increase shot lengths, which means that the landing zones are going to be a little bit farther down the hole than they would be at sea level. So again, nothing that a rating team needs to know too much about, other than the fact that if they're at altitude, they're going to be used to rating landing zones that maybe not the standard 250, 210, 200, and bogey's always the same. But if you live in a state which has varying altitudes, maybe you live in a state where there's some courses in a valley at 2,000 or 3,000 feet, like in Arizona, Phoenix, and then you go up in the mountains and they're at 5,000 feet. You just have to make sure you use the right table values for the shot lengths. So, and that is pretty much it with the effective playing length categories. Any questions pop up, John, on either wind or altitude?
Yep, a couple of questions, Scott. First off, where would the raters mark a wind adjustment on the form?
Yeah, on the Form 1, there's the left hand, and not everybody uses the standard, USGA or WHS Form 1, so it could be in a different place. But on the standard Form 1, there's a column on the left side of the form which has your course information, maybe the team captain, the course raters, the rough height, et cetera, stint meter. That's usually we're going to see something that says wind speed or wind adjustment, and then also altitude. So there's typically any Form 1, whether it's custom one or a standard one, is going to have a place to put course information, stuff that's specific to the entire golf course, not just hole by hole.
Perfect. And we've got one other wind question, and then one larger scope question after that. Would it be fair for an AGA to conclude that no wind adjustments should be considered for any course in their region?
Well, there's going to be some regions of the country that just don't have enough wind to meet the minimum that we have in the system. Again, it's an average. It's not, hey, there's going to be windy days everywhere. I mean, if you live in the, central Alabama, you may not get a lot of wind, but you may have days where it is windy. It's 15 to 20 mile an hour wind on the storms coming in, or there's a front coming in. So it is an average. So there are a number of states that I know, a number of AGAs that don't really use wind at all. So they just say we don't use any wind adjustment on any of our courses. So there are going to be a few like that, but majority of places will have areas that do have exposed areas, whether it's coastline, whether it's a large lake like in the Midwest, or coastal areas of the East Coast or the West Coast. They're going to have typically some sort of adjustment for wind. But if you look at those maps I showed you, there's not a lot of parts of the U.S. as a percentage that are windless or very, very low wind. There's wind everywhere. It's just whether it's high enough to make an adjustment.
Great. And just one last question. We've had this come in at a couple of different points during the webinar today. What's the plan for distributing these materials from today's session?
Yeah, so we have, as you said, John, early on, is that we have 3 of these sessions. We're going to do this one, and then we have 2 more that are going to cover, 5 obstacles each. So we're going to distribute these as we go, though. We're not going to wait till all 3 are done to distribute them at once. So we're going to provide these to the AGAs. We're going to give them a link through our community site to get to these presentations that they can distribute to others, that didn't make this webinar, or maybe joined after, maybe they join in a couple of weeks and they want to get some education. So, but as I think Matt or you said early on, we're also going to distribute a Q&A document to all the attendees. So those who signed up, we have the email addresses. We can send that Q&A right to each attendee based on the questions submitted today.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott.
Perfect.
All right. So moving forward, like I said, we're actually a few minutes ahead, but we do have those 2 upcoming webinars. We have May 20th, also a Thursday, topography, fairway, green target R&R, and bunkers. And then we're going to cover the remaining obstacles, crossing obstacles, lateral, trees, green service, and psych, Thursday, June 3rd. These are recorded, first of all, and that's where if some of you can't make all 3 sessions and you were hoping to, contact your AGA, and they should be able to get you a copy of the or access to the recording. So if you made today but you can't make the 20th, don't worry about it. You can obviously see it in a recorded version. So we're going to go, like I said, those 5 obstacles here in May 20th, and then the remaining 5 on June 3rd. Hopefully this gives everybody a pretty good background on the course rating system and a little bit more in depth than just a very standard basic seminar that we've done in the past with some of our webinars. But obviously we'd love to get out and do these in the field at times with going on the golf course and so forth, but with COVID restrictions, with travel restrictions, it's just not feasible, and that's one of the reasons we decided to do these. But we know that most AGAs are able to go out and rate courses. Courses are busy, as we've heard from many AGAs, that they're having a hard time even getting time on the golf course because they're booked from sun up to sundown with golfers. But it's glad to know that people are out there doing ratings, because a year ago it was looking like it could be a wash almost for a while with doing any ratings. So anything you want to add, Matt? I know you haven't spoken in a while.
Yeah, no, what you said is absolutely true. Just to sort of speak to the distribution. So as I believe John mentioned earlier, the AGA, the Golf Association, or whatever jurisdiction you're in, will have access to the recording. It'll be posted shortly. John, myself, Scott, look at all these questions that we didn't get to. We provide the answers, in a document, just a Word document form, and we'll actually distribute that directly to you, that Word document with the Q&A. The recording, we want you to get comfortable going through the AGA, and certainly use that as a resource as for them to also provide education material. So that's, and obviously those upcoming sessions, we'd love to have you be a part of it. And certainly we referenced the guide there on the previous slide. You saw the picture of the cover of the guide. If you're able to gain access from the AGA, if you don't have a guide or whatever, certainly reach out to the Golf Association in your respective area, and they can certainly be happy if they want to provide a copy of the guide for you for next time, or just to stick your nose in it, just to read through some of the material we talked about today.
Okay, and thanks to everybody for attending and sticking around for the full 90 minutes, it looks like, and hopefully we get to talk again here in another couple of weeks with our next version, or next segment, I guess, of the seminar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.